Welcome Classic Rock fans to an episode of Classic Album Review, where classic albums are excavated and explored. And today we're looking at Pink Floyd's Ummagumma. 1969 is a fascinating year for this band as they move away from those 3-minute slices of pop psychedelia drawn from the paradigms of folklore and fairy tale. And the music had morphed into this vast, more spatial than space rock, sonic soundscaping. But it's within these explorations that we start to see the germs of their conceptual masterpieces, which very much define them in the 1970s. Barrett, of course, by 68 was lost to this acid-drenched haze of inarticulation. Once they lost their charismatic and talismanic frontman, they really weren't sure which direction they were going to go in. There's no doubt that the band's management, Peter Jenner and Andrew King, at this point felt that the departure of Syd Barrett was commercial suicide for this band. I mean, Barrett, of course, had penned their most successful single to date, See Emily Play, undoubtedly being the creative force or muscle behind Piper at the Gates of Dawn. The thought of the band continuing without him seemed inconceivable. They had thought of him taking a kind of a Brian Wilson role where he just sat at home and wrote tunes, so to speak, and they kept him away from the live circuit. But unfortunately, I don't think he was any better at home than he was on the live circuit. So he had been rendered rather mute, unable to provide the band with these little slices of psychedelic whimsy from the wings. Barrett's last performance took place at the Pavilion Ballrooms on Hastings Pier on the 20th of January 1968. But it was the following gig in Southampton where the band decided, we just won't bother picking up Syd, eventually ending his tenure with the band. But Syd nevertheless continued to haunt this band, eventually morphing to the brilliant and dazzling metaphor of the Crazy Diamond. Even hanging over the proceedings of 1979 like a big Cheshire cat, emerging on Waters' hymn to alienation with Hendrix's perm and wild, staring eyes. Many of the books written about Pink Floyd tend to be guilty of adopting an attitude of it all began with Syd, and moving straight to the masterpiece of the classic lineup that they put out in the 1970s, effectively leapfrogging the period from about 68 to 72. But nevertheless, it's this material that I find absolutely intriguing in terms of this band's evolution. Many of the ideas and themes that would be explored on their later albums could be excavated from these long sonic explorations. And it certainly maps a journey towards those classic 1970s albums, but it's also accelerated, of course, by Waters effectively taking the wheel and effectively navigating the band from the fringes of outer space to write about more philosophical and political issues. And this shift away from those early lysergic pieces were accompanied, of course, by the inclusion of David Gilmour. As I said, David Gilmour brings a musical orthodoxy to this band, a kind of grace, and makes a massive contribution in terms of the sound of this band. You think about early stuff like Set the Controls to the Heart of the Sun, Careful the Hex Eugene, and of course Saucerful of Secrets, which has been, as I've said many times, dismissed by Gilmour as just psychedelic noodling. But as I've said, I think these pieces are very important in terms of the band trying to work out where it was they were going to go. If we consider the second album, which is a bit of a hodgepodge really, it's a largely Sydless affair, who nevertheless haunts the proceedings like the Canterville Ghost, and the band suffers through the lack of Barrett's childlike cadences and surrealism are replaced by this eclectic hodgepodge of psychedelic soundscaping, especially in the very avant-garde title piece. We do get the valedictory Jug Band Blues and the beautiful, or one of the best Floyd songs ever in my opinion, the beautifully right-penned Remember a Day. But what is interesting is the emergence of Waters' voice amid this cacophony, this melee of experimentation. We get the flirtations with psych pop with Let There Be More Light and Corporal Clegg. There emerges narratives of alienation and loss, replacing the gnomes and sprites and affected innocence of the early material. And of course the band's live performance, there was an evolution with a shift away from just, rather than just being a psychedelic experience and light show, there was an element of performance brought in there with choreographed elements like the Man and the Journey tour. And these conceptualized stage presentations and theatrical flourishes would be continued to be explored way into the 70s. You get pieces like the Masked Gadgets of Exemenes, which is really just a hodgepodge of songs that would appear on the More album, and Ummagumma. These performances were subdivided into two sections. It was the Man and the Journey. And these were punctuated with theatrical flourishes such as a staged tea party and men in gorilla suits. And of course Richard Wright got to play the Albert Hall organ when this was performed live. I think part of that actually makes its way onto the last Floyd album, The Endless River. These thematic ideas and conceptualizations would eventually merge into recorded voices and tape loops, which would so define their masterpiece of 1973. So this stuff is very important in terms of signposting where the band are actually at, and it provides that perfect bridge between the Barrett era and the band they would eventually become. This album was released on the 25th of October 1969, and by many it was just considered a complete disaster, including the band themselves. They've all dismissed it as absolute nonsense. I think Nick Mason said the one thing we learned about Ummagumma is that not to do another Ummagumma. A sprawling, ill-disciplined affair, which takes its name from Cambridge slang for a quick and loose sexual encounter, Ummagumma, or Ummagumma as I've heard some people say it. Of course, one of the most iconic aspects of this album is the sleeve, designed by Stomp Thorgerson and Hypnosis. The sleeve itself doesn't necessarily signify anything other than tapping into quite a few popular artistic motifs at the time. For example, the Drost effect, if I pronounced it correctly, we get that kind of picture within a picture that goes into infinity. I think the French call it a mise en beam or something like that. But these ideas were certainly apparent here. It places this album very much in the context of the late 60s. Interesting is the copy of Gigi, which is positioned against the wall. This was airbrushed out for Australian and American versions, leaving effectively a white square on the album sleeve due to copyright restrictions. Bit of classic rock trivia for if you're interested in the house where this photograph was taken. It was actually taken, the house is located in Great Shelford near Cambridge. I don't know the exact address, of course, but maybe you can look it up, who knows. And you get that iconic rear sleeve where all the equipment is sprawled out on the taxiway of London's Biggin Hill Airport. This is a kind of reminiscent. It was supposed to replicate the very famous exploded aircraft type pictures that were very popular at this time. The idea for the back sleeve is attributed to Nick Mason. There are two figures, of course, on the back cover. Alan Stiles, who would later feature on Alan's Psychedelic Breakfast, and Peter Watts, who was the band's road manager at the time. Tragically, Peter Watts leaves the band around about 1974 and later dies of a heroin overdose. In fact, the voices of he and his wife, Puddy Watts, can be heard on Dark Side of the Moon. And the live set of Ummagumma was actually recorded in two locations. It was at the Mothers Club in Birmingham on the 27th of April 1969 and the Manchester College of Commerce on the 2nd of May 1969. But in my opinion, I think the band are fairly poorly represented on this record. It's a much better document of the band live at this time is found on the Early Years box set and the Amsterdam gig. Interesting, the track Embryo was recorded during the Ummagumma sessions but was actually left off the album. It would, however, form a staple piece of the band's live set all the way up to about 1972. The song, when it was performed live, was greatly extended. Why it was left off the album, I presume it's because it just didn't fit, in the sense that you had two sides of live material and you had two sides of solo material, and this song was a band collaborative effort that kind of didn't fit the mould at the time. It did re-emerge on some compilations, of course, Pink Floyd The Works, if anyone remembers that one. I think there was also another compilation called Picnic, which may have been a European compilation, and it was featured on that one as well. If we listen to some of the solo material, Richard Wright's Sisyphus, for example, you can hear some of the elements that would emerge on the later albums. It contains elements of the avant-garde and a sort of free-form jazz in some respects. So Richard Wright, of course, was later to just dismiss this as a completely pretentious. And to be honest with you, much of this solo material sounds as if it's just been made up on the spot. Of course, the character of Sisyphus is drawn from mythology, who was destined to spend an eternity rolling that huge boulder up a hill, which I think is a befitting metaphor for how one feels when about to listen to this album. Waters, several small creatures gathered in a cave and grooving with a pict. There was a collaboration with Ron Geesin. And Ron Geesin was quite an important figure in the Pink Floyd world at this time. He, of course, is behind the band's absolute masterpiece, in my opinion, which is Atom Heart Mother from 1970. He also collaborated with Roger Waters on the solo album From the Body. From the Body is almost a Pink Floyd album, really, as they all play on it. but it's just credited to Geeson and Waters, who explore, literally as the title says, the music of the body, you know, incorporating lots of farts and belches and other windy instrumentation. The idea was that the music should be more corporeal than ethereal, I guess. But Pink Floyd certainly dallied with ideas of making music from strange objects, which was part of the Household Objects project, which never came to fruition, although some of the resonances of that made their way onto the Wish You Were Here album. At Grantchester Meadows, this bucolic and pastoral scene that was influenced greatly by the band's love of Crosby, Stills and Nash. However, it lacks that edge that this American music had, that was very popular at the time, this rootsy Americana, this rejection of all the swirling vagaries of psychedelia to engage with something that was more authentic. But with this song by Waters, Grantchester Meadows, it just comes across as very English and prissy. For my mind, the highlight of this solo album is The Narrow Way by David Gilmour, because those beautiful guitar tones, and he's got such an incredible voice as well, and the melodic lines are wonderful. I don't think he'd be able to sing it now. He reaches his upper register quite convincingly on this early recording, but there's no way I think he'd be able to manage it live now. Not that he'd want to anyway. Even if you listen to the Amsterdam recording, you can hear he's kind of struggling with this one. In terms of its style and sound, it's an important piece. It was actually morphed into The Narrow Way from an earlier piece called Baby Blue Shuffle, which was actually performed as part of a BBC session. Gilmour said of this track that I just kind of went into the studio and bullshitted my way through it. I think that was probably the prevailing attitude for the whole of this record. One of the most painful listens on this album is the Nick Mason solo stuff, which is like 10 minutes of drum soloing, really, which isn't salvaged at all by his wife playing flute over sections of it. Out of the whole album, I think that's the one section that people just can't stomach these days. However, despite this album being thought of as a bit of a disaster and dismissed by the band, it's still, I think, an intriguing listen, an intriguing document of the time. Anyway, you've been watching an episode of Classic Album Review. I'd like to thank you all for being patrons and supporting my work on my main YouTube channel. Just leaves me to say I hope you stay well, healthy, and more importantly, of course, is that you keep listening.